Imagine the most lethal, battle-hardened warriors on Earth.
Right, Navy SEALs.
Exactly. I mean, we're talking about operators who are trained to deploy from submarines in pitch-black waters, right?
Mm-hmm.
Guys who do halo jumps into hostile territory and execute missions with just, like, absolute precision.
It's intense.
It is. You picture this environment of high-tech weaponry, explosive action, and total chaos. But if you step into the actual world of basic SEAL training in Coronado, California...
Oh, man. Yeah.
The very first thing you see completely shatters that Hollywood image.
It really does.
You see these incredibly intense, exhausted recruits standing at attention in a Spartan barracks, and the ruthless instructors are doing something that seems, well, entirely bizarre.
To say the least.
They are meticulously inspecting the exact 90-degree angles of the recruits' folded blankets, and then, this is the craziest part, they toss a quarter onto a wool mattress to see if it bounces high enough.
And if it doesn't bounce high enough to catch, the recruit is sent to roll around in the freezing ocean surf.
Right. It is the absolute definition of mundane, paired with the threat of severe physical punishment.
Tucking in your sheets and fluffing your pillow to a standard that borders on the obsessive.
Yeah, and that is the ultimate paradox we're exploring today on this deep dive. Why does the journey to becoming a Tier 1 operator start with a task most kids complain about doing on a Saturday morning?
That's the real question.
Today, our mission is to extract the psychology behind this madness. We are diving deep into the frameworks laid out by Admiral William H. McRaven.
Drawing heavily from his landmark book, Make Your Bed.
Right, which actually originated from a 2014 University of Texas commencement speech that just went massively viral.
It really resonated with people. And we were also pulling from his memoir, Sea Stories, to see how these principles hold up in the bureaucratic chaos of, well, the White House.
What strikes me immediately about this material isn't the military tactics, it's the universal psychology of surviving chaos.
Exactly. What's most compelling about the source material is that it strips away the military bravado.
Yeah.
It reveals these universal psychological structures. McRaven isn't really talking about how to clear a room or fire a weapon here. He's talking about the architecture of resilience.
Yes. The book presents 10 fundamental principles, forged in basic training and tested in global combat, but engineered for everyday life.
Right. He's dissecting the mechanisms of overcoming fear, relying on teams, and finding internal control when the external world is just rapidly disintegrating.
So let's look at the foundational environment of this training, the barracks at Coronado.
4 beds to a room, a closet, no air conditioning.
Yeah, and the sound of the ocean right outside. The day begins with this hyper-meticulous bed-making routine. We have the hospital corners, the perfectly folded gray wool blanket at the foot of the bed, the intense scrutiny of the instructor.
It's stressful just thinking about it.
But I want to analyze the specific utility of this. Because, making your bed doesn't protect you from the freezing water, right? Or the obstacle course you're about to face.
No, not at all.
So what is the actual mechanism at play here? Why does this matter to you, the listener, sitting at home?
Well, it's essentially a psychological firewall. To understand the mechanism, we really have to look at the neurology of the first completed task.
Okay, break that down for us.
So, when you wake up, your brain is transitioning out of a passive state. By immediately engaging in a highly structured, detail-oriented task, you are forcing your prefrontal cortex into an active executive functioning mode.
So you achieve a micro-victory right away.
Exactly. This triggers a small release of dopamine, which is a neuromodulator that doesn't just make you feel good, it actually lowers your threshold for taking action on the next task.
Oh, wow. So making your bed then is like writing the first line of code for how your day is going to operate.
That's a great way to put it.
You've established a baseline of agency. Once that perimeter is secured, the chaos of the rest of the day can't burn backward into those first 5 minutes of your morning?
Precisely. Because in an environment like SEAL training, or frankly in the modern corporate world or raising a family, your external agency is constantly being stripped away.
Right. You're at the mercy of your boss, your kids, the traffic.
Yeah, the instructors are going to tell you when to eat, when to sleep, when to suffer. You control almost nothing. So the bed is an anchor.
It is a physical manifestation of internal order.
Yes. And McRaven utilized this anchor throughout his entire life. When he was deployed in Baghdad, sleeping on a makeshift army cot, he still pulled the sleeping bag tight and aligned his pillow.
Even in a war zone.
Even there. It was a daily recalibration of his standard of excellence.
Looking strictly at the behavioral dynamics McRaven notes in his memoir, there's a fascinating contrast regarding this exact principle.
Oh, the Saddam Hussein story.
Yeah. In late 2003, U.S. forces captured Saddam Hussein. McRaven, as a senior commander, visited the captured dictator daily to ensure he was being housed properly according to protocol.
And the environment is critical here. Saddam was given a degree of luxury relative to a standard prisoner.
Right. He had a cot with actual sheets and a blanket. But McRaven observed a really consistent behavioral pattern.
Saddam never made his bed.
Exactly. The covers were perpetually crumpled at the foot of his cot. He seemed entirely uninclined to impose order on his immediate environment.
It's a profound behavioral contrast. You have the highly disciplined military commander who relies on the structure of making his bed to maintain his psychological baseline. And he's observing a deposed dictator who leaves his covers in disarray. It physically illustrates the core thesis. How you handle the microenvironment reflects your internal structural integrity.
Yeah, just to be clear, we're not taking political sides here, just looking impartially at the behavioral observations from the text.
Right, strictly as a character study.
But as crucial as that individual baseline is, the source material quickly pivots to show its limitations.
Because an anchor keeps you from drifting, but it doesn't move you across the ocean.
Perfectly said. Individual discipline is merely the prerequisite for the actual work, which fundamentally relies on mutual dependence.
The illusion of the lone, invincible operator is systematically dismantled in SEAL training.
And it's most visibly dismantled through the inflatable boat training, right? They call it the IBS, the inflatable boat small.
Yeah, and this sounds excruciating. It's a 10-foot rubber raft. 7 men have to carry this heavy boat on their heads.
Just carrying it on their heads.
Yeah, then they run with it across the beach and then paddle it through the winter surf off San Diego. And the waves are like 8 to 10 feet high, plunging relentlessly.
The physics of that boat demand absolute synchronization.
Oh, completely. If the 7 men do not paddle with the exact same stroke count and the exact same torque, the boat will be unceremoniously picked up by an 8-foot wave and violently dumped back onto the beach.
But the deeper psychological lesson here isn't just about synchronization, is it?
No, it's about the management of vulnerability.
I really want to dissect the mechanics of that vulnerability, because in a team of 7, human biology dictates that not everyone is going to be operating at peak capacity on any given day.
Right, we're not machines.
And McRaven admits this openly in the text. There were days he was completely drained, nursing a bone-deep fatigue or fighting off the flu.
And this is where the dynamic of the boat crew becomes critical. On the days McRaven was failing, the other men in the boat silently absorbed his deficit.
They just picked up the slack.
Exactly. They paddled harder. They dug deeper into the water. They literally gave him their physical food rations to help him recover.
That's incredible. And crucially, when the dynamic flipped, when McRaven was operating at 100% and another guy was sick, McRaven absorbed the deficit.
It's a localized ecosystem of shared suffering.
It completely rewrites the cultural myth we have of the solitary hero who just bootstraps his way to victory. No one survives that surf alone.
Nobody.
And McRaven actually experienced the catastrophic failure of the lone wolf mentality decades later in a way that nearly ended his life.
Oh, the parachute accident.
Yes, let's look at the parachute accident, because this is where the theoretical need for a team becomes violently literal.
The accident is terrifying. McRaven is a Navy captain at this point. He is doing a routine jump from a C-130 aircraft at 12,000 feet over California.
So he's way up there.
Yeah, he's in free fall, levels off, checks his altimeter, everything is perfectly normal. But at 5,500 feet, he looks down and realizes another jumper has slid directly into his path right beneath him.
The geometry of this is a nightmare.
It really is. The jumper below him pulls his ripcord. The parachute deploys upward, blossoming directly into McRaven, who is falling at roughly 120 miles per hour.
God, that's fast.
So McRaven hits the canopy, bounces off, and goes into a violent, uncontrolled spin.
And in a panic, he pulls his own ripcord.
Right, but because he is tumbling wildly, the deployment is catastrophic. The pilot chute wraps around one leg.
Oh, no.
And the main canopy partially deploys and wraps around his other leg. So he is hurtling toward the ground inverted with his legs bound by thick nylon webbing.
And when that main canopy finally catches the air and fills, the physics are just brutal.
Yeah, the parachute forcefully decelerates his momentum, but because the straps are wrapped around his legs, the opening shock violently rips his legs apart.
The text describes this in harrowing detail, doesn't it?
It does. His pelvis separated instantly. The thousands of micro muscles connecting his pelvis to his body ripped off the bone. His stomach muscles detached.
Unbelievable.
The pain was so absolute, he said his scream could probably be heard across the border in Mexico.
He hits the ground 2 miles outside the drop zone. The trauma is extreme. His pelvis was separated by almost 5 inches.
He ends up with a massive titanium plate and screws holding his skeletal structure together. And this is where the psychological devastation sets in.
Right, because McRaven was a physical operator. Yeah. His entire identity, his career, his sense of self-worth was intrinsically tied to his physical dominance.
And now, he is bedridden. He is entirely helpless.
He admits in the text that he descended into a deep self-pity, which is entirely rational. His body was destroyed. His career seemed over.
Understandable, yeah.
This is where the concept of the boat crew transcends the rubber raft and applies to the broader human experience. He could not paddle this boat alone.
No, he was fundamentally reliant on his wife, Georgianne.
Georgianne's role here is a masterclass in what we might call compassionate stoicism.
Absolutely. She handled the physical realities, cleaning his wounds, administering injections, but her real intervention was psychological.
She provided severe, tough love, didn't she?
She did. She refused to allow the self-pity to take root.
Yeah.
She actively reminded him of his core identity. He was not a man who quit.
She was paddling the boat when he couldn't even hold the oar.
That's a beautiful way to phrase it. And it wasn't just his wife. The institutional vulnerability is fascinating here, too.
You're talking about his commanding officer.
Yeah, Admiral Eric Olson.
Yeah.
He completely bypassed military medical protocol.
Wait, really? How?
Well, standard policy would have mandated a medical evaluation board, which almost certainly would have forced McRaven into medical retirement, given the severity of his skeletal damage.
That makes sense for the military.
But Olson risked his own institutional capital to shield McRaven, giving him the time to heal and save his career.
This completely redefines what we consider strength. In Western culture, we frequently correlate strength with complete independence.
We really do.
But McRaven's survival and his eventual rise to a 4-star admiral was entirely predicated on his willingness to accept utter dependence. The team is not a luxury. It is the fundamental mechanism of survival.
So we've established that routine anchors you and reliance on a team sustains you. But there's a trap here.
What's the trap?
We assume the best teams are the most physically imposing. We assume that if you have a massive muscular team, you win.
Oh, right.
McRaven's experience shatters that assumption completely when we look at how he evaluates sheer willpower over physical stature.
We are entering the territory of how we measure human potential. During SEAL training, the recruits are divided into boat crews based largely on height, right?
Yeah, so the boat rests evenly on their heads when they run. And this brings us to the famous Munchkin crew.
The Munchkin crew. I love this part. This was a boat crew composed entirely of guys who were under 5'5".
And biologically speaking, a shorter wingspan and a shorter stride length should be a massive disadvantage in swimming, running, and paddling.
The taller crews constantly mock them. They'd look at the tiny little flippers they put on their tiny little feet and laugh.
But the outcome defied the biomechanics. The Munchkin crew consistently out-paddled, outran, and outswam every other crew in the class.
How is that even possible?
To understand why, we have to look at the psychological concept of the central governor. It's a theory in sports science that your brain will signal extreme fatigue and tell your body to quit long before your muscles actually reach physical failure.
Oh, so the brain is trying to protect you.
Exactly. The Munchkin crew, however, had an extraordinarily high threshold for suppressing that central governor.
Where does that threshold come from, though? Why did the shortest guys have the strongest suppression of that quit signal?
Sociological conditioning. Consider the diverse makeup of this crew. An American Indian, an African American, a Polish American, a Greek American, an Italian American, and a couple of tough kids from the Midwest.
Okay.
Most of these guys had spent their entire lives being underestimated due to their height or their background. They had spent years building a latent reservoir of grit, just navigating societal microaggressions.
Oh, I see.
Every time they were told they were too small, it acted as a microstressor that built psychological calluses.
That makes total sense. By the time they hit the surf in Coronado, their ability to tolerate discomfort and process mockery was vastly superior to the taller guys who had historically coasted on their genetic, physical advantages.
There is a brilliant interaction in the text that perfectly illustrates this.
Oh, the swim test.
Yeah. The class is preparing for a morning swim in punishing 8-foot surf. The instructor inspecting them is a massive Vietnam veteran, well over 6'2".
A giant of a guy.
Right. He stops in front of a seaman recruit who is 5'4". The instructor grabs the recruit's flippers, waves them in his face, and leans in, whispering that the kid is too small, that the waves will break him in half, and that he should just quit right now.
The instructor is actively probing for psychological weakness. He is trying to activate that central governor.
But the recruit's jaw tightens, and he yells over the crashing waves, "I won't quit."
Wow.
The instructor leans in, whispers something else, and moves on. Later, after that tiny recruit finishes the swim near the very front of the pack, McRaven asks him what the instructor whispered.
The kid smiles and says, "Prove me wrong."
It is the ultimate jujitsu of motivation.
Taking external doubt and transmuting it into internal fuel. And, McRaven was actually forced to confront his own biases about physical stature before he even started training.
Right, through the legendary story of Tommy Norris.
Let's talk about Tommy Norris, because this is wild.
The Tommy Norris anecdote is a perfect case study in the halo effect, the cognitive bias, where we assume that because a person has one positive trait, like a physically imposing presence, they naturally possess other positive traits, like courage or resilience.
Right. So McRaven is a young college student visiting the Coronado training facility. He's looking at all these massive, intimidating SEAL instructors, and he feels pretty good because he himself is a strong, athletic guy.
He's feeling confident.
Exactly. McRaven is sitting in the hallway, and he sees this guy looking at the historical photos on the wall. The guy is slightly built, frail-looking, almost sickly, with a mop of dark hair hanging over his ears.
McRaven actually feels a pang of pity for him.
Yeah, he assumes this guy is a deluded civilian who wandered in thinking, there is no way this frail guy can carry a heavy rucksack and 1,000 rounds of ammo. He's going to get crushed.
But then the recruiting officer calls the frail guy into the office and introduces him. It is Lieutenant Tommy Norris,
the last SEAL to be awarded the Medal of Honor in Vietnam.
The details of Norris's service are astonishing. This quote-unquote frail man went deep behind enemy lines in North Vietnam on successive nights to rescue downed American pilots.
Just incredible bravery.
And on a later mission, he was shot directly in the face by enemy forces and left for dead. He survived the gunshot, battled through catastrophic injuries, and eventually became one of the founding members of the FBI's elite hostage rescue team.
And the ultimate irony. Back in 1969, Tommy Norris was almost booted out of SEAL training because the instructors thought he was too small and too thin.
It proves that our visual heuristic for evaluating human capacity is fundamentally flawed. You cannot measure the size of a person's heart with a tape measure.
So true. So, we established that internal drive trumps external reality. But that leads us to a deeply uncomfortable psychological truth.
What happens when your internal drive is perfect, your execution is flawless, and the external world punishes you anyway?
I want to spend some serious time unpacking the concept of the sugar cookie, because I think this is the most profound lesson in the entire text.
The sugar cookie drill is a mechanism designed to systematically break the just world fallacy.
Can you explain the just world fallacy for the listener?
Sure. In the late 1960s, a psychologist named Melvin Lerner formalized the theory of the just world fallacy. It's the cognitive bias that leads humans to believe that actions inherently yield morally fair and fitting consequences.
We are deeply conditioned from childhood to believe that if we play by the rules, work hard, and do good, we will be rewarded.
We need to believe that, right? Society wouldn't function if we didn't believe in cause and effect. But the SEAL instructors know that the battlefield does not care about fairness.
It really doesn't.
So they induce the sugar cookie. Here's how it works. A recruit will spend hours preparing his uniform for inspection. He will starch his hat so heavily it stands up on its own.
Oh.
He will press his uniform until the creases are sharp enough to cut paper. He will polish his brass belt buckle until it acts as a flawless mirror. He will execute the task to absolute objective perfection.
He stands at attention. The instructor approaches. The instructor looks at this perfectly prepared recruit, finds absolutely no flaw, and simply orders him into the surf zone anyway.
No reason given.
Right. The recruit has to run, fully clothed in this pristine uniform, into the freezing ocean, and then roll around in the soft sand on the beach until he is covered head to toe in wet sand.
Hence the sugar cookie.
He then has to spend the rest of the day in that uniform, cold, chafing, and deeply uncomfortable.
The physical discomfort is terrible, but the psychological friction is the real punishment. It is indiscriminate. It is arbitrary.
And McRaven notes that this broke a lot of guys. They would be furious. They would complain. They couldn't handle the cognitive dissonance of doing everything right and being punished anyway.
Exactly. When people who rigidly hold on to the just world belief encounter true unfairness, It shatters their worldview. They feel victimized.
They become cynical.
Yes, they stop trying. Because if the reward isn't guaranteed, why put in the effort? The sugar cookie drill forces the recruits to decouple their self-worth and their effort from the outcome.
The lesson is stoic in nature. Your control begins and ends with your effort. The universe owes you nothing.
This is so applicable to everyday life.
Think about it in your own life. It's the equivalent of spending 3 months putting together a massive corporate presentation, sacrificing your weekends, dotting every I and crossing every T.
Yep.
You deliver a flawless pitch, and the client cancels the project at the last minute because of some internal budget cut that had nothing to do with you. It's infuriating.
It really is.
But the sugar cookie principle demands that you don't throw a tantrum. You accept that life is fundamentally unfair, you brush off the sand, and you keep moving forward.
To illustrate this, McRaven offers the story of Moki Martin. Moki is presented as the quintessential frogman. He was a master of his craft, an expert in every weapon system, a phenomenal skydiver, an elite swimmer, and an early pioneer of the modern triathlon.
He was the guy everyone looked up to.
And every morning, he would bike 30 miles along the Coronado Silver Strand to maintain his peak physical condition.
And then, on a random Saturday morning, the universe decides to make him a sugar cookie.
He is pedaling head down, completely in the zone, hitting 25 miles per hour. A cyclist coming from the opposite direction veers into his lane.
And they collide head-on.
The physics of the crash are devastating. The other cyclist is relatively unharmed, gets up, and dusts himself off. Moki Martin suffers catastrophic spinal trauma.
He is instantly paralyzed from the waist down. The peak physical specimen loses the use of his legs forever.
If anyone had the right to scream about the just world fallacy, it was Moki. He did everything right. He served his country. He maintained his health. He was just riding his bike in the correct lane.
But McRaven notes that in the 35 years since that accident, he never once heard Moki complain.
Never asked, why me?
Never displayed an ounce of victimhood.
Because Moki had fully internalized the lesson. He brushed off the sand. He cognitively reframed his reality. He couldn't be a physical operator anymore, so he became an accomplished painter.
He became a dedicated father.
He founded the Super Frog Triathlon, which he continued to organize and oversee from his wheelchair for decades. He didn't let the unfairness of the event dictate his emotional baseline.
It is a breathtaking display of cognitive resilience. But, let me push back here. Accepting that life is unfair is one thing when the failure is arbitrary, like a bike crash or a moody instructor.
Right.
But what happens when the failure is genuinely your own fault? When you didn't measure up? Because McRaven transitions from the arbitrary punishment of the sugar cookie to the highly targeted punishment of the circus.
Yes, the circus is entirely different. The circus is a consequence of failing a standard. If a recruit wasn't fast enough on the obstacle course, or if they fell behind on a timed ocean swim, their name went on a list.
And at the end of the day, when everyone else was recovering, the recruits on that list had to attend the circus.
The circus consisted of 2 extra hours of grueling calisthenics, combined with relentless psychological harassment by veteran instructors whose explicit goal was to make the failures quit.
Just brutal. McRaven and his swim buddy, Mark Thomas, found themselves on the circus list after falling behind on a swim, and their punishment was endless flutter kicks.
Flutter kicks are torturous. You lie flat on your back, hands behind your head, legs straight out, lifting them slightly off the ground and scissoring them up and down.
And you can't bend your knees, right?
You cannot bend your knees because bending your knees is framed as a sign of weakness. You do hundreds of them until your abdominal muscles are screaming and the sun goes down.
But I want to debate the utility of this because the text describes the true terror of the circus as the death spiral. You fail a swim, you do 2 extra hours of brutal physical labor. The next day, your muscles are deeply fatigued, so your performance degrades further. Because you are fatigued, you fail the standards again.
You were sent back to the circus.
The fatigue compounds. It is a design cycle of degradation. But isn't there a threshold where the circus stops being a training tool and just becomes trauma? When does breaking someone down simply break them permanently?
That is the pivotal question. And the answer lies in the psychological framing of the suffering. In physical fitness, we have the concept of hypertrophy. You tear the muscle fibers down under heavy load, and if provided the right nutrients and rest, they repair themselves thicker and stronger.
Okay.
The circus is designed to induce psychological hypertrophy. The suffering only becomes trauma if the individual frames it as meaningless torture.
But if they frame it differently?
If the individual frames it as a crucible meant to force adaptation, It becomes a mechanism for growth.
That distinction between meaningless suffering and meaningful suffering is huge, because McRaven and Thomas actively decided they were going to alter their internal narrative.
They refused to view the circus as an execution block. They viewed it as extra training. And the physiology actually responded to the psychology. The math of the death spiral reversed.
Precisely. Because they didn't quit, those 2 extra hours of daily exercise eventually forced their bodies to adapt. They began to build a massive surplus of endurance. They got stronger.
They got significantly faster in the water.
And this culminated in the final open ocean swim of the phase. A 5-mile grueling swim in the freezing waters off San Clemente Island. It is the ultimate test of endurance.
McRaven and Thomas swim for 4 solid hours. They hit the beach, utterly exhausted, numb, bordering on hypothermia.
The instructor is waiting for them on the sand, screaming at them, telling them to drop down and do push-ups, berating them for embarrassing the class.
It's a classic misdirection, because when they finally stand up and look around the beach, it's completely empty.
No one else is there.
They weren't last. They were the very first pair to finish the swim. The second-place pair wasn't even in sight yet.
The instructor stops yelling, smiles, and shakes their hands. The circus, the very thing designed to break them, was the exact mechanism that made them the most elite swimmers in the class.
And McRaven had to apply this exact concept of bouncing back from failure later in his actual career, when the stakes were not calisthenics, but his professional reputation.
Right. In July 1983, McRaven was essentially fired. He was relieved of his command of a SEAL squadron because he aggressively tried to change the culture, and he clashed with his superiors.
It was a monumental professional failure. In the tight-knit community of special operations, reputational death is almost impossible to recover from. He was viewed as a pariah.
People were whispering that he didn't have the judgment to lead.
He was faced with the ultimate choice. He could ring the bell, resign his commission, and start a lucrative civilian career, or he could weather the storm of humiliation and rebuild.
He chose the latter. He was given a marginal second chance as an officer in charge of a deployed platoon, and he approached it with a hyper-vigilant humility.
He notes that when you live in close quarters with 12 heavily armed, highly trained SEALs, there's absolutely nowhere to hide. They know if you are a fraud.
They see if you are putting in the work. So McRaven made sure he was the first in line to jump out of the plane, the last in line to eat in the mess hall, and the one staying up all night planning the operations.
He used the failure of his firing as a psychological fuel for the circus of his redemption. He outworked his damaged reputation.
And it paid off. He ultimately rose to become the commander of all SEALs on the West Coast.
This transitions perfectly into the necessity of taking calculated risks, because if you are perpetually terrified of failing again, you will never push the boundaries of your capability.
Let's look at the mechanics of risk-taking. Specifically, Chapter 6's focus on daring greatly. During training, there is an obstacle known as the slide for life.
It is a 100-foot rope suspended tightly between a 30-foot tower on one end and a lower tower on the other. You have to climb the tall tower, grab the rope, and get across it.
The standard, institutionalized method for crossing this rope was known as possum style. The recruit hangs underneath the rope, gripping it with their hands and wrapping their legs over it, and slowly caterpillars their way down the incline.
It is slow, it requires immense grip strength, but it is highly stable. It is the safe, risk-averse way to navigate the obstacle.
But McRaven was losing too much time. His times on the overall obstacle course were lagging because the possum style was so slow.
A Vietnam veteran instructor pulls him aside and mocks him, telling him that the course is going to beat him every single time unless he is willing to accept some actual risk.
So McRaven analyzes the geometry and the physics, and a week later, he climbs the tower and switches to commando style.
Instead of hanging underneath the rope, he pulls himself up and lies flat on top of the rope.
Just lying on top of it.
He balances his center of gravity directly over the nylon and thrusts himself headfirst down the incline, using one leg acting as a brake.
It is exponentially more dangerous. If his center of gravity shifts an inch to the left or right, the rope will violently flip him.
He will fall 30 feet to the hard ground.
He will sustain a severe injury, and his training will be over. But he manages the fear, executes the maneuver, and slides down the rope in a fraction of the time, easily breaking his personal record for the course.
I want to be very clear here about the distinction between taking a calculated risk and being reckless. The commando style was not reckless. It was a known technique that required absolute focus and physical precision.
Right. Risk aversion guarantees mediocrity. Calculated risk-taking is the boundary line of greatness. And we see this principle scale up from a single recruit on a rope to massive institutional decisions in a war zone.
Let's fast forward to Iraq in 2004. McRaven is now an admiral, commanding Special Operations Forces. He is overseeing a highly sensitive, time-critical hostage rescue mission.
The intelligence indicates that 3 hostages are being held by al-Qaeda in a walled compound, and the terrorists are preparing to move or execute them. They do not have time to plan a stealthy night raid. They have to act immediately, in broad daylight.
Daylight raids violate standard special operations doctrine. Darkness is a tactical shield. It provides the element of surprise and conceals movement. Executing a raid in the middle of the day strips away every advantage the operators have.
Furthermore, the objective building is entirely enclosed by an 8-foot brick wall, creating a massive logistical hurdle for inserting the assault force.
The plan they come up with is audaciously risky. They decide to fly 3 massive Black Hawk helicopters directly over the wall and land them simultaneously inside the tiny courtyard of the compound.
The visual of this is almost incomprehensible. A Black Hawk helicopter has a rotor span of over 60 feet. The courtyard is barely large enough to fit them.
They're talking about landing 3 multi-ton aircraft in a dust storm with literally inches of clearance between the spinning blades and the brick walls.
McRaven is watching the operation unfold from the command center via a surveillance drone. The first Black Hawk flares up violently, crests the 8-foot wall, and drops heavily into the courtyard.
The dust immediately blooms. The second helicopter follows, flying entirely on instruments and spatial awareness, and lands with its nose practically catching the tail of the first aircraft.
The third helicopter comes in blind. The dust plume from the first 2 birds has completely obscured the courtyard. The pilot is inching the massive machine over the wall, but he misjudges the clearance by a fraction.
The rear wheel of the Black Hawk slams violently into the 8-foot brick wall. Bricks explode everywhere. The aircraft shudders, but the pilot manages to force the nose down and thud into the dirt before the rotors strike the building.
They execute the breach, neutralize the threats, and rescue all 3 hostages. 30 minutes later, the assault force is flying back to safety. McRaven attributes this success to the ethos encapsulated by the British Special Air Service motto, "Who dares wins."
But again, it's not blind daring. The decision to authorize that raid relied on McRaven's absolute granular knowledge of the extreme competence of the 160th Special Operations Aviation Regiment pilots.
He knew they had the technical skill to pull off an inches clearance landing. He calculated the risk against the capability of his team.
Exactly. Risk is a mathematical equation. But whether you are sliding down a rope head first or flying the helicopter into a courtyard, those are challenges of physics and geometry. Life also presents us with biological and psychological predators.
This brings us to the psychology of standing your ground when every evolutionary instinct in your brain is screaming at you to run. We are talking about the sharks, both literal and metaphorical.
Part of the SEAL training curriculum involves a 4-mile night swim off the coast of San Clemente Island. And these Pacific waters are globally recognized as a primary breeding ground for great white sharks.
The instructors do not hide this fact. They actively brief the students on the marine predators. They discuss the leopard sharks, the makos, and the hammerheads. But the great white is the apex predator they focus on.
And they teach the recruits a highly specific behavioral protocol for encountering one.
The protocol is fascinating. They tell the recruits that if a great white begins to circle them in the dark water, they must not act afraid.
They cannot swim away, because fleeing triggers the shark's predatory pursuit instinct. They must hold their position in the water.
And if the shark actually darts toward them to attack, the recruit must summon every ounce of strength and punch the shark directly in the snout.
From a behavioral ecology standpoint, this is brilliant. The great white shark operates on an energy conservation heuristic. It probes for weakness. It wants an easy meal that will not injure it.
If the prey panics and flees, the heuristic confirms it is weak and safe to attack.
But if the prey holds its ground and delivers a violent kinetic shock to the shark's most sensitive sensory organ, the snout, the shark's heuristic recalculates. The prey is deemed too dangerous, and the shark retreats.
It is the ultimate metaphor for dealing with bullies in any sphere of life. The psychological architecture of a human bully is identical to the hunting heuristic of a great white.
Bullies feed on the emission of fear. They probe for psychological weakness. If you retreat, they press the attack.
If you hold your ground and punch them in the snout, metaphorically enforcing an unyielding boundary, they recalculate and find an easier target. Ask yourself, What sharks are currently circling in your office, in your relationships, or in your own mind? Are you thrashing around trying to swim away, or are you preparing to punch them in the nose?
McRaven had to utilize this exact psychological architecture on a geopolitical level. We return to his interactions with Saddam Hussein in the makeshift prison cell.
When Saddam was captured, he was stripped of his military uniforms, dressed in a standard orange jumpsuit, and confined to a small room. McRaven brought the newly appointed leaders of the Iraqi government into the cell to physically demonstrate that the dictator was deposed.
But the demonstration completely backfired. Saddam did not cower. He sat on his cot with a look of absolute deadly contempt.
When the new Iraqi leaders began to yell at him, venting decades of trauma, Saddam simply smirked. He radiated this aura of dark arrogance, and then he subtly motioned with his hand, directing the leaders to sit down.
And because these men had lived in mortal terror of Saddam for their entire adult lives, their conditioning took over. They reflexively obeyed. They grabbed folding chairs and sat down in front of him.
Even in an orange jumpsuit, surrounded by American guards, Saddam was successfully utilizing environmental dominance to rule them through fear. He was acting as the apex predator in the room.
McRaven immediately recognized the behavioral dynamic. Saddam was feeding on their fear to maintain his internal illusion of power, so McRaven systematically dismantled the environment that allowed the bully to feed.
He isolated Saddam. He issued strict orders to the guards that they were not to speak a single word to the prisoner. They were to provide no emotional feedback whatsoever.
And McRaven enforced the physical boundaries himself. Every day, he visited the cell. Saddam, trying to reestablish his dominance, would stand up to greet him, attempting to dictate the terms of the interaction.
McRaven refused to speak. He simply looked at the dictator and used hand gestures to force him to sit back down on the cot.
It was the psychological equivalent of punching the shark in the snout. By refusing to engage verbally, refusing to show a millimeter of intimidation, and silently enforcing physical dominance, McRaven neutralized the bully's primary weapon.
When the target refuses to broadcast fear, the bully's power completely evaporates.
Standing up to an external predator requires immense courage, but is fundamentally an outward-facing conflict. The deepest reservoirs of resilience are required when the conflict is entirely internal, when the darkness is literal and emotional. This brings us to the underwater ship attack.
The underwater ship attack is widely considered the most technically complex and terrifying evolution in SEAL training. The parameters are staggering.
The recruits have to swim 2,000 meters underwater across San Diego Bay in the dead of night. They must navigate to a specific anchored ship, locate the keel, place a practice magnetic mine on the hull, and extract themselves completely undetected.
The environmental conditions are designed to induce maximum sensory deprivation. The recruits are breathing through an Emerson closed-circuit diving rig. It leaves no bubbles on the surface, ensuring stealth, but it is notoriously finicky.
The operators morbidly referred to it as the death rig because malfunctions had previously killed divers.
The water visibility in the bay is near zero. The only light they have is a tiny, glowing green chemical stick to illuminate the dial of their compass.
And as they approach the target ship, the environment degrades even further. The massive steel structure of the ship blocks out the moonlight and the ambient glow of the San Diego skyline.
As they swim deeper, navigating under the curving hull toward the deepest center point, the keel, the darkness becomes absolute. They cannot see their own hands touching their face masks. The noise of the ship's massive engines and machinery pounding through the water is deafening and disorienting.
Under those conditions, the amygdala, the fear center of the brain, is screaming for the diver to surface. The sensory deprivation combined with the acoustic assault creates an overwhelming impulse to panic.
If a diver panics, they lose their spatial awareness, they hyperventilate, and they die. The chief petty officer instructing the class tells them explicitly, when you are under the keel, it will be the darkest moment of your life. You must decouple from your fear. You must rely purely on your training and maintain your composure.
McRaven carried the metaphor of being under the keel for decades, because while the physical darkness of the bay is terrifying, the emotional darkness of human loss requires an even more profound level of composure.
He transitions in the text from the bottom of San Diego Bay to the tarmac of Bagram Air Base and Dover Air Force Base, discussing the ramp ceremonies.
The ramp ceremonies are the solemn military rituals where the remains of fallen service members are transferred from a hearse or a helicopter onto a massive C-17 transport plane to begin the journey home. The emotional gravity of these events is crushing.
McRaven paints an incredibly vivid and heartbreaking picture. You have the honor guard standing at perfect parade rest. You have the stark, rhythmic sound of the drum and the haunting notes of Amazing Grace playing over the tarmac.
You see the caskets draped in the American flag. And surrounding this scene are the families and the unit members, engulfed in an unimaginable, spirit-breaking grief.
Yet within this absolute emotional darkness, McRaven observes human beings exhibiting a transcendent level of composure. He notes the twin brother of a fallen soldier, standing with a ramrod-straight posture, suppressing his own devastating grief to physically support his brother's friends and hold his parents together.
He observes an aviation crew who had just lost their pilot in a horrific crash, standing on the tarmac to pay their final respects, and then climbing into their helicopters the very next morning to fly another mission because they knew the fallen pilot would demand they continue the fight.
It is the ultimate manifestation of being your best in the darkest moments. Whether you are physically trapped under 2,000 tons of steel in pitch-black water, or you are standing on a freezing runway mourning the death of your closest friend, you have to find a mechanism to arrest the panic and the despair. You have to locate that internal reserve of deep, practiced composure.
But composure is ultimately a defensive posture. It allows you to survive the darkness, to actually move forward, to endure the prolonged suffering required to change reality. Humans require an offensive mechanism.
They require hope. This transitions us to the mud flats of Hell Week, where we see the neurology of hope play out in real time.
Hell Week is 6 days of continuous physical torment and sleep deprivation, and the psychological climax occurs at the Tijuana mud flats. Geographically, this is a swampy, low-lying coastal basin where the drainage creates a vast expanse of thick, freezing, clay-like mud.
It is Wednesday evening of Hell Week. The recruits have been awake for over 3 days. They're ordered to march into the mud flats and sit down until the freezing muck covers them up to their necks. As the sun sets, the temperature plummets.
The wind picks up to 20 miles per hour, howling across the open flats. The recruits are violently shaking, their teeth chattering so hard it sounds like machinery.
The instructors utilize this extreme physical vulnerability to deploy a devastating psychological tactic. An instructor walks to the edge of the mud with a bullhorn. He offers them immediate salvation. He tells them there is a blazing fire waiting for them on the beach.
He promises them hot coffee and warm chicken soup. All they have to do to end the suffering is quit. But there is a catch.
The instructor sets up a twisted prisoner's dilemma. He says he needs 5 men to quit. If 5 men stand up and walk out of the mud, the entire rest of the class can go to the fire.
He is attempting to weaponize their suffering against their unit cohesion. He wants them to mentally negotiate, to justify quitting by telling themselves they are doing it to save their teammates. And the tactic nearly works.
McRaven observes the recruit sitting next to him physically breaking down. The recruit stops shivering, his eyes go blank, and he begins to lunge upward to escape the mud. The instructor smiles, knowing that the moment one man breaks the psychological seal, a dozen others will follow.
But right at that precipice, someone in the mud starts singing. It's a raspy, terribly out-of-tune voice, but it cuts through the howling wind. Within seconds, a second voice joins in, then a third. Soon, the entire class of freezing, exhausted recruits is belting out this song.
The recruit who is about to quit stops his upward momentum, turns back to McRaven, links arms with him, and starts singing as well.
The instructors are furious. They scream into the bullhorns, threatening the recruits with even more time in the mud if they don't shut up. But the threat of future punishment is completely hollowed out by the collective action. The singing only gets louder.
And McRaven notes a phenomenon that seems scientifically impossible, but psychologically profound. As the singing swelled, the mud actually began to feel warmer. The wind seemed a little tamer. The sun seemed just a little bit closer to rising.
To understand why the mud felt warmer, we have to look at the neurobiology of shared vocalization under duress. When the brain is subjected to extreme cold and pain, the amygdala triggers a severe stress response, flooding the body with cortisol.
But singing out loud requires measured, rhythmic breath control. This forced respiration engages the parasympathetic nervous system, which actively slows the heart rate and dials back the panic response.
Furthermore, synchronizing vocalization with a group releases a massive surge of oxytocin, a neuropeptide that enhances social bonding and actually acts as a mild analgesic, dulling the perception of physical pain.
So they literally altered their neurochemistry through song. They shifted their cognitive focus away from the unbearable present moment and anchored it to a shared, survivable future. That is the biological definition of hope. One person decided to sing, and it inoculated an entire group against despair.
The contagion of hope is perhaps the most powerful force McRaven identifies. He ties this visceral experience in the mud to a profoundly moving event involving Marine Lieutenant General John Kelly. Following a catastrophic helicopter crash in Afghanistan that resulted in the deaths of 38 service members, the families of the fallen were gathered at Dover Air Force Base.
The atmosphere in the hangar is suffocating. President Bush is there. Senior military leaders, including McRaven, are there trying to offer condolences. But McRaven admits the deep sense of inadequacy. He feels that his words of comfort are ringing hollow, that he cannot possibly penetrate the absolute devastation these families are experiencing.
But then McRaven watches General John Kelly interacting with the families, and the dynamic is entirely different. The grieving parents and spouses are clinging to Kelly. They're holding his hands, weeping on his shoulder, and finding a genuine, palpable solace in his presence. The words he is speaking are resonating with a profound frequency.
And the reason why is heart-wrenching. General John Kelly was not just speaking as a senior commander, he was speaking as a father who had endured the exact same nightmare. Just a few years prior, his own son, Marine First Lieutenant Robert Kelly, had been killed in combat in Afghanistan.
General Kelly was the physical embodiment of surviving the unsurvivable. He and his family had absorbed the ultimate trauma, and they were still standing. By simply walking into that room and projecting strength and empathy, he transmitted hope. He showed those devastated families that while the pain would never fully dissipate, it would not destroy them. The human capacity to endure is boundless if it is anchored in hope.
Hope is the fuel. But what does the fuel prevent you from doing? It prevents you from committing the ultimate irreversible act of surrender. This brings us to the brass bell.
The brass bell is the central icon of SEAL training. It hangs prominently in the center of the Coronado compound, highly polished, gleaming in the sun. It is visible to every recruit every single day.
On day one, the instructor explains the function of the bell. He tells them that the training is going to push them beyond their perceived limits of physical and mental endurance. They are going to suffer. But he offers them an incredibly simple way out. If the pain becomes too much, all they have to do is walk up to the center of the compound and ring the bell 3 times. Ring it, and you don't have to freeze in the surf anymore. You don't have to endure the circus. The pain stops instantly. But the instructor warns them with absolute certainty. If you ring that bell, you will regret it for the rest of your life.
The bell represents a permanent solution to a temporary problem. Ringing it is a psychological concession that you can never undo. But we need to make a critical distinction here. In the broader context of life and business, there is a massive difference between a strategic pivot and a moral surrender.
Let's debate that. Because sometimes quitting seems like the objectively rational choice. If you are pouring your life savings into a business model that the market has clearly rejected, or if you are in a career path that is destroying your mental and physical health, isn't ringing the bell the smart move? When does perseverance just become stubborn self-destruction?
It's a vital nuance. Quitting a failing business strategy is a tactical pivot based on external data. You change the method to achieve the ultimate goal of financial independence. But ringing the bell in the context McRaven describes is not a tactical pivot. It is a surrender of your core character. It is abandoning your ultimate goal, in this case, becoming a SEAL, simply because the temporary physical or emotional discomfort became too high. You are not quitting the strategy. You are quitting on yourself.
To perfectly illustrate the refusal to surrender, McRaven shares the story of Army Ranger Adam Bates. Bates is a 19-year-old kid. He is younger than McRaven's own children. He is deployed on his very first combat mission in Afghanistan, and during an operation, he steps on a pressure plate improvised explosive device.
The detonation is catastrophic. McRaven visits Bates in the combat hospital shortly after the casualty evacuation. The physical devastation is immense. Bates has lost both of his legs. He has suffered severe blast burns across his body. His face is swollen almost beyond recognition, and he has a breathing tube down his throat and chest tubes draining fluid from his lungs.
McRaven is standing at the foot of the bed, struggling to find the words to say to a teenager whose life has been so violently, irrevocably altered. Bates cannot speak around the intubation, but the attending nurse mentions that Bates's mother is deaf, so he is fluent in sign language. The nurse hands McRaven a laminated chart of basic signs.
And amidst the hum of the life support machines, through a haze of fentanyl and agonizing pain, this 19-year-old double amputee slowly raises a heavily bandaged hand. He looks at McRaven, and using trembling fingers, he signs 3 words: "I will be okay."
It is an absolute defiant refusal to accept victimhood. His body was shattered, but his internal architecture was pristine. He refused to ring the bell of self-pity. And McRaven notes that Roughly a year later, he attended a Ranger change of command ceremony. And there was Adam Dates, in his dress uniform, standing tall on prosthetic legs, laughing with his unit, and challenging his fellow Rangers to pull-up contests.
If a 19-year-old can lose his legs in an explosion and immediately cognitively reframe his future to sign, "I will be okay," the threshold for what we consider an unbearable obstacle in our daily lives needs to be drastically reevaluated.
It puts every minor inconvenience into staggering perspective. But taking these elemental life and death principles forged in the mud of Coronado and the hospitals of Afghanistan and applying them to the messy, bureaucratic reality of civilian or political life requires a shift in context. And the bonus source material we have, an excerpt from McRaven's memoir, Sea Stories, provides the perfect laboratory to see these lessons applied in an environment of absolute geopolitical chaos.
The vignette is set in October 2001. We're just weeks removed from the September 11th attacks. The Pentagon is still physically smoldering. The nation is rapidly mobilizing for a global war. McRaven is stationed at the White House, serving as a director in the newly formed Office of Combating Terrorism under General Wayne Downing, a legendary hardened former Ranger.
The environment in the White House is pure cognitive overload. It is a circus of conflicting priorities. And McRaven finds himself at the epicenter of this bizarre collision of demands. On one hand, he has Congressman Dana Rohrabacher literally barging into his office. Rohrabacher is furious. He is clutching a satellite phone, claiming he is in direct contact with an Afghan warlord named General Dostum, who is actively fighting the Taliban on horseback. Rohrabacher is screaming at McRaven, demanding that the military immediately launch CIA cargo planes to airdrop winter gear and horse feed to this warlord.
It is a profound violation of protocol. You have a sitting congressman attempting to run tactical logistics for a foreign warlord from a cell phone in a White House office. McRaven, deeply conditioned to respect the chain of command, hesitates. He knows a staff officer cannot simply bypass the Pentagon and order the director of the CIA to launch airdrops based on a politician's tantrum.
But General Downing returns to the office, calmly assesses the political and tactical reality, picks up a secure phone, calls the CIA director, and simply demands it gets done. And the next day, the planes are flying. It perfectly illustrates the need to adapt your rules of engagement when the environment is entirely unprecedented.
But the true absurdity, the real test of McRaven's cognitive flexibility, is happening simultaneously on his desk. While he is dealing with screaming politicians and coordinating tactical airdrops of horse feed, he has been assigned a drafting task by the National Security Advisor. He's been ordered to write a letter from President George W. Bush to Pope John Paul II.
The juxtaposition is almost comical. He has to write a letter to the Vatican, laying out the philosophical and theological justification for the impending invasion of Afghanistan. He even points out the absurdity himself in the text. He notes that the greatest philosophers, scholars, and theologians in human history have spent thousands of years debating the concept of just war theory, from St. Augustine to Thomas Aquinas. And McRaven, a Navy SEAL operator, has been given exactly 1 week to solve the theological riddle and draft the letter.
It is the ultimate example of the circus applied to the real world. Real-world challenges do not arrive sequentially. They do not wait for you to finish your tactical logistics before presenting you with a profound philosophical dilemma. You have to synthesize the chaos. And this is exactly why the rigid structure of making the bed, the psychological baseline established at the very beginning of the day, is so vital. When the environment demands that you simultaneously manage a warlord's cavalry and draft papal theology, you need an internal anchor.
He utilized that baseline, engaged his prefrontal cortex, and executed the tasks. The airdrops reached the warlord, aiding the initial push against the Taliban, and 3 days later, McRaven finished the theological draft, which was polished, signed by the president, and delivered to the papal nuncio.
When we synthesize these 10 lessons, from making the bed to refusing to ring the bell, we see that they cascade into an impact far larger than the survival of a single individual. In his commencement speech, McRaven presents the mathematics of exponential impact. He notes that the average American will meet roughly 10,000 people in their lifetime.
If you take these principles, if you stand firm against the sharks, if you sing in the mud to provide hope, and you fundamentally change the lives of just 10 of those 10,000 people, the math becomes staggering. If those 10 people each change the lives of 10 more, and that process repeats for just 5 generations, you have actively altered the trajectory of 800 million lives.
A young squad leader in a hostile urban environment decides to suppress his panic, rely on his training, and take his unit left instead of right, avoiding a fatal ambush. That single demonstration of composure under pressure saves the lives of 10 men. but it also preserves the existence of their unborn children and their children's children. One decision, rooted in discipline, echoes through generations.
It all ripples outward from the discipline of that very first completed task. Making the bed, acknowledging the necessity of the team, measuring your peers by the size of their heart, not their stature, brushing the sand off when you become a sugar cookie, embracing the pain of the circus to build hypertrophy of the mind, sliding headfirst into calculated risk, punching the predators in the snout, decoupling from panic in the darkest moments, utilizing the neurobiology of hope to warm the mud, and refusing, under any circumstances, to surrender.
The architecture of resilience is available to anyone willing to impose order on their internal environment when the external world descends into chaos.
To wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave you with one final thought to mull over. Visualize that brass bell hanging in the center of the SEAL compound at Coronado. It is perfectly polished. It is always there, shining in the sun. And it is constantly whispering a promise of immediate relief from whatever is currently difficult, painful, or overwhelming in your life right now. What is your brass bell? Is it the urge to abandon a grueling project? Is it the temptation to walk away from a complex relationship because the friction is high? Is it the desire to lower your personal standards because the circus of daily life has left you exhausted?
The temptation is universal. The relief the bell offers is real, and it is immediate. But as the instructors warn, the regret is permanent.
Exactly. So ask yourself, what will your life look like 10 years from now if you refuse to ring it? Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. We've explored the depths of San Diego Bay and the chaotic halls of the White House. But the journey to changing your world doesn't start with a grand geopolitical strategy. It starts incredibly small. Take the very first step right now. Go make your bed.